It's February 5th, 1919, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
The film industry press described it as a rebellion when four huge cinema stars, including Charlie Chaplin, went before the cameras today in history in 1919 to set up a new kind of company that was intended to, and I quote, protect the industry from itself. This was the birth of United Artists.
Yeah, and just to put into context exactly how famous these four were, Charlie Chaplin was the most famous man in the world in 1919. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks with the Julia Roberts and George Clooney of the day. It was like that level of famous, and making them even more exciting, they were romantically linked. They would get married the following year. So they were like this massive it couple. And then Griffith, not as well known, not megastar on that level, but he was a director and he was revered for his technical sophistication, and he could do action, he could do highbrow drama. I was trying to think of a comparison. It would maybe be like a Ridley Scott, could do the blockbusters but also do things that are a bit more thinky. So these four had a tremendous amount of star power behind them.
Yeah, and obviously in these days now, self-publishing, hello, here we are, is not really that surprising. But back then, the idea that the stars could just set up their own studio was a revelation because everything in Hollywood was emerging. In fact, Hollywood itself was emerging as the nucleus of the film industry, in part due to the war. America was neutral, so they could sell Hollywood pictures all over the world. And this comes, as you're saying, at a stage where these four individuals are at maximum star power and decide to go it alone. So why did this happen? In 1918, Charlie Chaplin could not get the studio that he was working with at the time, First National Pictures, to increase his production budget. Like Orson Welles, he's one of these artists that always wants more money for the next picture, despite being one of their top producers and, as you say, one of the most famous people in the world. So he got his brother, Sidney, who managed him, to look on the sly into what was going on, because he was such a huge moneymaker for the studio. Why couldn't they find more money for him? And Sidney actually approached some other stars to look into their contracts, hired a PI who discovered that there were planned mergers coming among the big Hollywood studios, and this is in the time of the system where the stars are linked to a particular company and can't work for anyone else. And those studios between them were conspiring to lock actors into 5-year contracts.
And the other thing that this merger of Paramount and First National in particular was planning to do was put a, quote, clamp on the lid of their salaries. And this was just after Pickford, Fairbanks and Chaplin had willingly toured the country selling war bonds purely out of a sense of patriotism. But as they went around the country, these huge crowds reinforced their own confidence in their own star power. They were like, hang on, we've got hundreds of thousands of people turning out for us all around the country. Why are we handing so much of the profits over to producers? After all, aren't audiences coming to see us rather than the producers behind the films? And meanwhile, executives at production companies were asking themselves a similar question. Why are we paying stars so generously? Because let's face it, stars weren't getting no money.
Yeah, they very much were not getting no money. Chaplin's salary itself had gone from $100 per week when he was first employed, which we discussed in our episode on him, very rapidly up to $1,000 a week to $10,000 a week, which was unimaginable. I mean, that is about $13 million per year in today's money. And because this was unprecedented, there'd never been a star of this scale before, producers just simply could not fathom that he needed more than that.
Yeah, the other thing that was upsetting them was that the studios and cinemas operated on a block booking system where if the cinemas wanted the big pictures with the big stars, they also had to take a bunch of B movies and filler from the same studio. And as Fairbanks put it, he said, we were used as a club over the exhibitors and the magnates in the swivel chairs made the money. They were aware that if they were able to sell their big blockbuster productions as individual movies, they could stand to make a lot more personally. But there was an artistic imperative too. Their concern was that if the movie business, as it was becoming more vertically integrated, that movies were going to have to be greenlit not just by studios, but by the distribution companies and by the cinema chains, and that creativity and art would suffer within that. And all three actors who formed United Artists were also producers. They had their own kind of in-house production units within their studio. The studios would actually learn from this because the next generation of stars would be kept strictly on the talent side. But because of what Chaplin's brother had uncovered, about these mergers, they found out that one aspect of the mergers was that the studios were going to do away with these independent production units. They were troublesome, they gave stars ideas above their station. It ended up with Chaplin coming to you asking for more money for his next picture. So learning that their own creative as well as financial potential was going to be impacted, they decided to take action.
And also their plan was to make an enormous number of films. In the first year, they were each planning to release 5 films. So, it would have ended in this amazing outpouring of creativity that they could all individually control. As it turned out, it was much more difficult to set up a company than they anticipated, and so they didn't manage to put out so many pictures. But the way that they'd structured the company as well was intended to return the profits directly to themselves. And I think that was a big part of what was going on here. So each of the 4 founders held 25% of the preferred shares, which is what governs how profits are split up, and 20% of the common shares. And that's where the voting power comes from.
And I think they possibly underestimated the extent to which the moguls that had set up the studios in the first place themselves had been taking enormous risk and were disrupting an industry, and how difficult it was to pull off. In that way that creatives often do when they keep themselves completely church and state separated from the mucky business of promoting stuff. If you look at their statement of purpose on this day, it says, and it's interesting that this paranoia is being invoked over a century before AI, quote, "We think that this step is positively and absolutely necessary to protect the great motion picture public from threatening combinations and trusts that would force upon them mediocre productions and machine-made entertainment." Without an appreciation that machine is a very recently constructed thing, which was an enormous gamble. It's an interesting battle, this, because it's not quite sort of disruptors against the establishment. Hollywood had only just been established, and mostly by Jewish immigrants who had arrived themselves in America with no money and took a massive punt on this burgeoning industry. They were disruptors as well, really, and it wasn't an easy business to run.
No, especially because Chaplin, Pickford and Griffith were all contracted to this machine that they were railing against. It took 7 months for United Artists to release its first in-house production, precisely because all 3 of them had to complete their existing contracts with their studios. In fact, Chaplin wouldn't actually produce a film for United Artists until 1923. This also made it really hard to find investors because they were understandably put off by the erratic release schedule. Lots of United Artists productions in those years would be self-financed by the stars themselves because, even as the Hollywood studio machine was getting slicker and slicker, why on earth would you want to release a film through a distribution company that only works when its stars are free?
Yes, yeah. And actually that's, again, comes back to that key pledge that they made of no block deals. It's all very well saying, each film's going to be individually profitable and will stand and fall on its own merits. But what about when it falls? Then it's kind of counterproductive, isn't it? Because the whole point of a slick commercial organisation is it does slip out some duds with the hits. And it does say, you are only going to be able to have the Chaplin movie if you take these 3 that we're not sure about and one of them will work. And, they killed off that income stream.
As soon as they'd set up the company, it ran into some trouble. And by the 30s and 40s, United Artists was facing a combination of mounting legal battles as well as declining cinema attendance and its own inconsistent output. And alongside this, you've got the rise of television. So this hopeful company that arose with this artistic vision was suddenly, being buffeted by all the same forces that all the other studios were being buffeted by.
And at the same time, talkies had arrived in the mid-20s, and that's kind of a problem when your 3 big stars have built their careers in silent movies.
Yeah, and for all the talk of artistic freedom, and creativity, those big flagpole productions in the early years were swashbucklers with Douglas Fairbanks. He was, the action star of the day. It was stuff like Robin Hood, The Thief of Baghdad. It wasn't necessarily creatively pushing the envelope. It was what audiences wanted to see. And then later on, in 1924, Griffith sold out of the company, and his replacement was a producer called Joseph Schenck, who happened to have Buster Keaton as his brother-in-law, which meant, again, now you had other blockbusters like The General being distributed by United Artists that kept helping to prop them up. And they sort of ran into this issue where they would snap up movies from these really great independent producers, people like Walt Disney, David O. Selznick, but once they got established, they tended to then gravitate towards the more reliable major studios, partially because they owned, or as good as owned, the major theatre chains. And actually, United Artists got a bit of a break in 1948 because the Supreme Court ordered the major studios to end monopolistic practices, including owning cinema chains. And that made it so that producers and actors who wanted to be producers had more incentive to go independent. So in the 1950s, United Artists found a bit of stability. They had hits like The African Queen and High Noon, and more artistic stuff. They distributed Marty and 12 Angry Men, both won Oscars. But as Arian was alluding to, overall cinema attendance was losing out to TV. And the two living founders, Pickford and Chaplin, sold out eventually in the mid-50s.
And simultaneously, the big boys still exist, right? I mean, you've come up with this kind of alternative model, but Warner Brothers is still there. And they want to cling on to what they used to do as long as they can. And Selznick actually, with Gone with the Wind, was going to release through UA, but ended going with MGM in the end because he wanted Clark Gable. And Clark Gable was with MGM under contract. The studios didn't stop doing that.
And I think it's also significant that at no point did United Artists try to sort of diversify the terms of their model so that any new artist who was coming in would also own their own work. You know, they kind of became another film company like the other film companies.
Don't worry, guys. The DNA of UA is safe and well. In 2024, MGM's parent company Amazon announced that United Artists as a label would be revived under former Netflix boss Scott Stuber. Films in the pipeline for the renewed UA include a remake of Basic Instinct, a reboot of Highlander, and Heat 2.
I don't think people know this, but Mary Pickford was the original casting in Basic Instinct.
Tomorrow.
Lenin decreed they should be murdered to remove any threat to the revolution.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.